There's a story that gets passed around late at night on the internet. A ship went down off Isle Royale in the 1880s. Divers found the wreck. And inside the hull, laid out in the cold water of Lake Superior, were skeletons, human skeletons, except these were 9 feet tall. And the story says that when the Navy heard about it, they didn't put the bones in a museum. They took them back out onto the lake, weighted them down, and dropped them into the deepest water they could find. It's a great story. People have built entire channels around it. Because here's the thing nobody making those videos will admit. There really is a mystery buried on this island. There really is something down there that the experts still can't fully explain. It's just not skeletons. So let's go to the island. Let's find out what's actually beneath the water and beneath the soil. And let's figure out why, out of every place in America, this one cold rock in the middle of a freshwater sea became... I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Home of one of the most repeated hoaxes in the country. Isle Royale sits in the northwest corner of Lake Superior, closer to Canada than to the state that owns it. It belongs to Michigan, but you can practically see Minnesota from its western shore, and Ontario is only about 20 miles off. It's 45 miles long and 9 miles wide, and today it's a national park, one of the least visited in the entire country. There are no roads, no cars. You get here by ferry or by seaplane, and only in the warmer months, because for half the year, Lake Superior turns into something you do not want to be sitting on top of. But that emptiness is deceiving, because Lake Superior is not a lake in the way you're picturing a lake. It's the largest freshwater lake on Earth by surface area. It holds around 10% of all the fresh surface water on the entire planet. There's an old saying among the sailors up here: Lake Superior never gives up her dead. And they don't mean it as poetry. The water is so cold and so deep that the bacteria which would normally bloat a drowned body and float it back to the surface simply can't survive down there. So people who go down tend to stay down right where they fell. Isle Royale is surrounded by reefs, long fingers of rock that reach out under the surface where a captain can't see them. The whole island is basically a series of stone ridges lying on their side, tilted up out of the lake, and those ridges keep going out into the water like traps set for anything that passes. So before we get anywhere near giants, understand this much: Isle Royale earned its reputation as a place where things vanish. That reputation is completely real. Let's start with the wrecks, because they're real, they're down there right now, and divers visit them every single summer. There are more than 25 known wrecks scattered around Isle Royale. At least 10 of them are large ships. And here's the detail the internet always leaves out. Because Lake Superior is so cold and so clean, these wrecks don't rot the way ocean wrecks do. They're some of the best preserved shipwrecks anywhere in the world. Take the America. She was a steel passenger steamer, a little over 180 feet long, and for 2 decades she was the lifeline of this whole stretch of the lake. She ran the mail, the supplies, the fishermen and their catches, and the tourists back and forth between Duluth and Thunder Bay, stopping at Isle Royale on the way. Then, in the early morning hours of June 7, 1928, she was steaming out of Washington Harbour. The captain had just handed the helm to the mate. 5 minutes later, she struck a submerged reef, started taking on water, and the crew scrambled to beach her before she went down completely. Everyone got off alive. 47 people, all rescued into the lifeboats. The only casualty was a dog that had been tied to the stern and couldn't be reached in time. Then there's the Cumberland, a wooden side-wheel steamer that ran hard onto the Rock of Ages reef back in 1877. A salvage crew tried to pull her free, gave up when the weather turned sour, and the lake tore her to pieces across the rocks. Years later, another ship, the Henry Chisholm, ran onto that very same reef in the dark and sank almost directly on top of her. Then there's the Emperor, a 500-foot Canadian freighter, the largest of them all. She went down in 1947, and not in a storm. She sank in calm weather, which is somehow worse because it came down to an exhausted crew making a navigation mistake at the end of a long shift. And because of that cold preserving water we talked about, the Emperor is hauntingly intact down there. Divers can still see the bunks where the men slept the night she was lost. But if you want a genuine ghost story, forget the giants for a moment and look at the Kamloops. In December of 1927, she simply vanished. No distress call, no wreckage, no survivors, nothing. For 50 years, nobody knew where she was or what had happened. Her entire crew had disappeared into the lake without a trace. And when divers finally located her in the 1970s, sitting in over 260 feet of frigid black water, they discovered that the crew were still down there too, preserved by the cold, held almost perfectly by the same water that had killed them. Superior never gives up her dead. Now notice something. 9 out of 10 of the big wrecks around Isle Royale went down for the same plain, terrifying reason. They ran aground. They hit rock they couldn't see. There's no real mystery about how any of them sank, but every single one of them fed the island's reputation as a place that swallows things whole and keeps them. And that reputation is the soil the giant story grows in. You need people to already believe this island hides bodies, and it does, just not the ones you were promised. So we have real wrecks, we have real bodies kept intact by cold water, resting where no one can easily reach them. We have a real place where the past just sits down there in the dark, waiting. Now here is where the genuinely unexplained part comes in, and it isn't in the water at all, it's in the ground. If you hike certain trails on Isle Royale, you'll walk right across them without ever noticing. Shallow pits in the earth, depressions worn into the bedrock. Around one inlet alone, a place called Macargo Cove, archaeologists have counted more than 1,000 of them, over 1,000 pits. They aren't natural. Somebody dug every one of them by hand. And when the first European and American miners arrived here in the 1800s hunting for copper, they found these pits already waiting for them, some of them driven more than 60 and 70 feet down into solid rock. Think about what that actually means for a second. Somebody, long before Columbus, long before any written record of this place exists, was sinking shafts 60 and 70 feet deep into some of the hardest rock on the continent. And the tools they left behind weren't iron. They were stones, round beach cobbles, worn smooth by the waves, gripped in the hand, and used as hammers to beat the copper free from the rock around it. Archaeologists have pulled thousands of these hammerstones out of the pits and the piles of waste rock. They've found the charred remains of fires the old miners built against the rock face, heating the stone and then throwing water on it to crack it apart. They've found a wooden bowl roughly 3 feet across that was used to bail water out of the deeper workings. And when scientists carbon dated the scraps of wood found jammed into the sockets of copper tools, the numbers came back almost hard to believe. At least 6,500 years old. And it wasn't a single burst of activity either. The mining went on in waves for something like 4,500 years. The people who did this work are the ancestors of the Ojibwe and the other nations of the Great Lakes, and the island itself still carries that memory in its oldest name. Minong. So here is the real mystery, and it happens to be an economic one, which is exactly why the revisionist crowd circles it like sharks. Where did all that copper go? Isle Royale copper is unusual stuff. It comes out of the ground almost pure. Native copper, geologists call it, meaning you don't have to smelt it out of ore, because it's already metal. You just have to free it from the rock that's holding it. And there was a great deal of it. In the 1870s, when modern miners were working the island with modern tools, they uncovered a single mass of copper weighing nearly 6,000 pounds, and on the surface of that enormous chunk they found something that stopped them cold. Tool marks. The surface had already been hammered and worked by the ancient miners thousands of years before any of them were born. One of the mine superintendents actually wrote that in opening their principal mines they were literally following the path of their ancient predecessors. They were digging where the old miners had already dug, because the old miners had already found the best copper on the island and left the map of it behind in the rock. So how much copper came out of here across those thousands of years? And this is exactly where the story gets slippery. Back in 1961, two researchers named Dreyer and Dew Temple ran the numbers and produced an estimate. Over 750,000 tons of copper, they said, mined out of the Lake Superior region in ancient times. 750,000 tons. That is a staggering figure. And if you take it at face value, it leaves you with a genuinely wild question, because there are not 750,000 tons of ancient copper artifacts sitting in the museums of North America. Nowhere close to it. So if all that copper was really pulled out of the ground, then most of it seems to have simply vanished off the face of the continent. And that gap, that missing copper, is the hole the fringe theories drive straight through. Some people claim the copper was shipped across the ocean to feed the Bronze Age of the Old World. That Isle Royale was secretly supplying ancient Europe with the metal for its tools and weapons. That there was a lost trade network spanning the Atlantic, or a lost civilization running the whole operation, or, yes, a race of giants doing the heavy lifting. The copper goes missing, and into that empty space people pour whatever it is they already wanted to believe. But here is what those videos never get around to telling you. That 750,000 ton figure was checked. Later researchers, including David Johnson and Susan Martin, went back through the original work and found that the estimate had been built on exaggerated and inaccurate assumptions from the start. The number was wildly inflated. The real quantity of copper mined here in ancient times was a small fraction of that headline figure. And once you use realistic numbers, the Great Vanishing mostly stops being a mystery at all. All those ancient copper objects that have actually been found, the knives and awls and fish hooks and beads and ornaments spread across the whole Great Lakes region and traded far beyond it, they add up. The copper didn't disappear across an ocean. It got worked into tools and jewellery and traded hand to hand across the continent over thousands of years. We find Lake Superior copper in burial sites hundreds of miles away, carried along trade routes that reach deep into the interior. The trade network was absolutely real. It was simply a Native American trade network built and run by native people, and not the lost European empire somebody wanted it to be. And that is the pattern you are going to watch repeat itself for the rest of this story. So learn it now. Somebody takes a real and fascinating fact, in this case the ancient mines, and they wrap it in a bad number, the inflated tonnage, and then they use the gap between the two to smuggle in something that was never there. The mines themselves are astonishing. The people who dug them were far more skilled than the settlers ever wanted to give them credit for. That is the true marvel of this island. It doesn't need giants to be amazing. And that brings us at last to the giants. To understand the 9-foot skeletons, you have to go back to the 1800s, and you have to understand what a newspaper actually was in that era. In the middle of the 19th century, printing suddenly got cheap and literacy rates shot up across the country. Almost overnight there were hundreds of small newspapers, and they were all clawing at each other for readers. People called it the penny press. And the way you sold papers back then was not with careful, sober, verified reporting. It was with the most sensational headline you could possibly dream up. There was no fact-checking to speak of. There were no photographs yet to prove or disprove a wild claim. If you wrote that a farmer out west had ploughed up a human skull the size of a bushel basket, who exactly was going to travel out there to stop you? And giants sold papers. They sold beautifully. Between roughly the 1840s and the early 1900s, American newspapers ran story after story after story about enormous skeletons dug out of the ground. 8 feet tall, 10 feet, 12 feet. One paper in Missouri ran a completely invented account of an entire underground city discovered beneath the town, with massive stone streets and a giant skeleton slumped over a public fountain. The Indianapolis Journal reported a 9-foot skeleton in 1883. Major papers in Ohio, Wisconsin, Kentucky, and New York ran their own versions. According to one anthropologist at the Smithsonian who later studied the phenomenon, these reports were surfacing at a rate of 2 or 3 every single month, at the peak of the craze. Now, why did people swallow them so eagerly? Two reasons, and both of them matter to where we're going. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. First reason is religion. A great many Americans at the time read the Bible completely literally, and the Bible mentions giants walking the early earth, the Nephilim. So when a newspaper announced that giant bones had been unearthed in a field, a lot of readers didn't hear a hoax at all. They heard confirmation. Physical proof of the world they already believed was true. They wanted the giants to be real, and want is a powerful thing when it comes to belief. The second reason is darker, and it is the real key to this entire story. All across the Midwest and the South, settlers kept finding these massive ancient earthworks, enormous mounds, some of them shaped like animals stretching across the landscape, some of them larger and more sophisticated than anything the settlers themselves knew how to build. And the prevailing belief at the time, soaked through with the racism of the era, was that the Native Americans they were actively driving off that very land could not possibly have built anything so impressive. So they invented a story to explain it, a vanished race, a superior ancient people who supposedly built the mounds and were then wiped out. Maybe they were strayed Europeans, people said, maybe a lost tribe of Israel, maybe descendants of a wandering Welsh prince, maybe a race of giants. Historians today have a name for this whole tangle of ideas. They call it the mound builder myth, and it was politically convenient in the ugliest way imaginable. Because if some noble vanished race had built the mounds and the native tribes had destroyed that race, then white settlers taking the land weren't really stealing anything at all. In the logic of the myth, they were simply reclaiming it, avenging the lost builders, continuing an ancient story rather than ending a living one. That is what the giant skeletons truly were. Not evidence of titans who once walked America. They were props in a story a young nation told itself so it could feel decent about what it was doing to the people already living here. The bones, real or invented, were characters in a lie about who belonged on this land and who did not. And this is the direct connection back to Isle Royale. Remember those ancient copper mines? The exact same myth got draped over them. Surely, people said, the native people of the lakes couldn't have sunk those deep shafts and moved all that copper. It must have been the lost race. It must have been the giants. And so the mounds and the mines got swept together into one single fantasy, and the real achievements of real native people got quietly handed over to imaginary titans. So how on earth did the Smithsonian end up cast as the villain of all this? Because in the real version of events, the Smithsonian is the institution that told the truth, old, and a lot of people hated it for that. Here is how the confusion got started. In the late 1800s, the Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology ran an enormous project to survey and excavate the ancient mounds across the country. They asked local diggers everywhere to send in bones and artifacts for proper study. So there really was a pipeline. Real remains really did flow from small towns all over America into Washington. In fact, before modern repatriation laws existed, the Smithsonian ended up holding more than 18,000 Native American skeletons in its collections. And the newspapers of the day knew perfectly well that the Smithsonian's name carried weight and authority. So, over and over again, the giant skeleton stories would end on the same convenient note. The bones the papers would write were sent off to the Smithsonian for study. It made the whole hoax sound official, and then, just as conveniently, the bones were never heard from again because of course they had never existed in the first place. Now here is what genuinely did happen. In 1894, a Smithsonian ethnologist named Cyrus Thomas published a massive report. Over 700 pages of careful work. He had spent years methodically studying the mounds themselves, and his conclusion was about as clear as a conclusion can get. The mounds had been built by the ancestors of living Native Americans, not by giants, not by Vikings, not by a lost white race from across the sea, by native people. Full stop. Then, in 1934, another Smithsonian scientist, the curator of anthropology, a man named Alois Hrdlicka, went even further. He flatly rejected the entire idea of an ancient race of giants 7 and 8 feet tall. He had examined the claims directly, and he explained exactly why people kept getting fooled by them. Part of it, he said, was simply the will to believe. People wanted giants to be real, so they saw giants. And part of it was that the amateurs digging these bones out of the ground didn't understand human anatomy. But watch closely what happens next, because this is the genius and the poison of a well-built conspiracy theory. The Smithsonian had debunked the giants, so the believers simply flipped the whole thing inside out. If the Smithsonian says the giants aren't real, they reasoned, then the Smithsonian must be the one hiding them. The very act of telling the truth got recast as the cover-up. The institution that stood up and said these bones do not exist became, in the retelling, the shadowy institution that made the bones disappear. And you cannot argue your way out of that, because it is built to be unbeatable. Every piece of evidence against the giants gets turned into fresh proof of the suppression. The more the experts explain, the guiltier they are made to look. It is a perfect closed loop, and it runs forever. Now fast forward to the year 2014. An article goes viral online. It claims that the Smithsonian has admitted, supposedly in a court case, to destroying thousands of giant skeletons in the early 1900s in order to hide the truth about a lost race of giants. The story spread like wildfire. Millions of people saw it and passed it along. And it was completely, entirely fake. It came from a website that openly published invented news stories for entertainment. There was no court case, there was no admission of anything, there were no destroyed giants. Every word of it was made up. But it went viral anyway. And that is the uncomfortable part, because it went viral for a reason. Millions of people already wanted it to be true. The 2014 hoax did not create the belief. It just fed a hunger that had been building steadily since the days of the penny press, since the mound builder myth for well over a century. And once you have a hunger like that in people, you can attach it to almost anything. You take a real mysterious place, Isle Royale, with its genuinely ancient mines and its genuinely preserved shipwrecks, and its real earned reputation for swallowing things whole. You add the century-old giant skeleton template that everyone half remembers. You sprinkle in the Smithsonian cover-up logic that can never be disproven. And then you invent one or two fresh details to make it feel specific and new and yours, a precise date, 1888, a branch of the government with weight behind its name, the Navy, and a shipwreck full of 9-foot skeletons that got quietly dumped back into the deepest part of the lake. Every single ingredient of that story was already sitting there on the shelf, waiting. The mysterious island, the bodies preserved in cold water, the vanished bones, the trusted institution recast as the villain, the convenient reburial that neatly explains why there is no evidence left to examine. Somebody just snapped the familiar pieces together and stamped a fresh date on the top of it. And there is no record of any Navy operation off Isle Royale in 1888 recovering 9-foot skeletons. There is no wreck tied to the tale. The Navy was not even the body responsible for salvage on the Great Lakes. That date, that branch of service, they are doing precisely what the old phrase sent to the Smithsonian did 100 years earlier. They are borrowing the authority of an official-sounding institution to make a campfire story feel like a filed government report. Now, if you have spent any real time in the deeper end of alternate history, you have run into the idea of Tartaria, and Isle Royale gets pulled into that whole world too, so let's meet it head on. The Tartaria idea, boiled down, claims that there was once a vast, advanced, forgotten global empire, and that nearly all record of it has been deliberately erased from our history. Its supporters point at grand old ornate buildings and say that no one back then could possibly have built such things, so they must really be the surviving relics of that hidden empire. And that is the exact same move as the mound builder myth, only scaled up from a single region to the entire planet. The reasoning underneath is identical, beat for beat. Something impressive exists. We refuse to credit the ordinary people who actually built it. Therefore, a lost and superior civilization must have done it, and therefore, someone powerful must be hiding the proof. And that is precisely why the Isle Royale copper mines are such catnip for that worldview. Here is a genuinely ancient, genuinely impressive feat of engineering. Shafts 60 and 70 feet deep cut through solid rock with nothing but fire and stone hammers. If your entire framework is built on refusing to believe that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, then those mines look like a smoking gun. But it is the very same trick every time, in every costume. And once you have seen the shape of it clearly, you genuinely cannot unsee it anywhere. Real achievement, plus a stubborn refusal to credit the real people who achieved it, plus an inflated or an outright invented gap in the evidence. And out the other end comes a lost race and a cover-up. The mounds, the mines, the ornate buildings of the old cities, the 9-foot skeletons in the sunken ship. It is one single story, wearing a different mask each time it walks back onto the stage. And the saddest part, the part that actually matters when you set the entertainment aside, is who gets erased in the process. Every time somebody hands the copper mines of Isle Royale over to a lost race of giants, they are quietly taking a real accomplishment away from the real human beings who earned it. The people who came out to this brutal frozen island thousands of years ago and worked out how to pull pure metal from solid stone using fire and beach cobbles, those people are not a mystery, and they are not gone. Their descendants are still here. The Ojibwe never left this landscape. The island's real name, Minong, is still right there on the maps. That is not a suppressed secret hidden in some vault. It is a plain truth that has been sitting in the open the entire time, while people go chasing phantoms across the internet. So let's go back down to the water one last time and take a proper inventory of what is really there, because I don't want you leaving here thinking Isle Royale is dull just because it isn't actually haunted by titans. Down there in the cold, you have one of the finest collections of shipwrecks anywhere on the planet. The America with her staircase still standing, the Emperor with the bunks where her lost crew slept their final night. The Cumberland and the Chisholm tangled together on the same reef, two separate disasters sharing a single grave. The Kamloops hidden away for 50 years, her crew held by water so cold it very nearly stopped time itself. Up on the island, above the waterline, you have more than 1,000 pits dug straight into the bedrock by human hands. Some of the oldest metal mining known anywhere in the world, worked and reworked across 4,500 years. You have hammerstones by the literal thousand. You have a wooden bowl that somehow survived 6,000 years in the ground. You have the actual provable carbon-dated story of one of the earliest industries in the whole history of our species. How much copper truly came out of this island, how far it really travelled, how a trade in metal was organised and sustained across an entire continent, thousands of years before writing ever reached these shores. Those are real, open questions, and the people working on them have actual expertise, and the answers, as they come, will be about human ingenuity and human effort, not about hidden titans. The 9-foot skeletons and the Navy's midnight reburial in 1888 were never any part of that real story. They are a mirror, and nothing more. When you look hard into the legend, what you are really seeing looking back is us, our hunger for wonder, our deep suspicion of authority and expertise, and, if we are being honest with ourselves, 150 years of a country telling itself one very comfortable lie about who built what on this land, and who was here first. The real Isle Royale never needed the lie in the first place. A ship full of drowned men kept perfect by the cold, waiting in the black water where no one can reach them. An island scarred all over by shafts that were sunk before recorded history began. Metal that was carried across half a continent by hand, and traded and buried with the dead 1,000 miles from where it was born. That was always the story. It was the story the entire time. It is only that the truth quietly asks you to be amazed by real people who really lived, while the myth lets you be amazed by ghosts who never did. So the next time that thumbnail slides across your screen, the giant bones and the shadowy Navy boat and the year 1888, you are going to know exactly what you were looking at, not a discovery at all. A very old story wearing a brand new costume standing on top of a real mystery that was there the whole time, hiding in plain sight. Lake Superior never gives up her dead, but if you are patient with her and honest, she will give up the truth.